Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Hornung. I am a senior political scientist and the Japan lead for the National Security Research Division at the RAND Corporation. It's my pleasure today to bring to you the 10th iteration of RAND's U.S. Japan Alliance Conference Series focused on issues of importance to the U.S. Japan Alliance. Over the years, we have examined issues as diverse as Japan's relations with Europe and South Korea, Japan's development of strike capabilities and amphibious capabilities, how the alliance is responding to a rising China, perspectives on the Quad, and lessons that can be learned from the ongoing war in Ukraine for the Indo-Pacific region. As this brief snapshot of these past topics illustrate, this series has highlighted some of the most pressing issues facing the U.S.-Japan alliance. And to discuss them, we've been fortunate over the years to bring together a stellar team of experts in the field to provide their insights into the challenges and opportunities facing the United States and Japan. Today will be no different. As all of you know, the focus of our event today is on the free and open Indo-Pacific region. The term free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, is now a common phrase in our lexicon, but it's only a few years old. Back in 2016, then Prime Minister Abe Shinzō gave a speech in Kenya, where he laid the seeds for his vision of FOIP and the need for the international community to cooperate to uphold the existing order. Today, we talk a lot about geopolitical competition. But even within that, when we look at our competitors, we still find ways to cooperate on regional and global challenges, such as climate change. It is within this dynamic of cooperation and competition that FOIP came into being. I will let our presenters today lay out what FOIP is and is not. But let me frame today's event by stating that the concept of FOIP has been enduring because of the flexibility in this era of cooperation and competition. FOIP does not set out one voice or one path, nor does it advocate competition. Rather, FOIP embraces diversity and different approaches in support of a mutual objective of peace and prosperity. While Japanese leadership has changed since FOIP was first unveiled, the fundamental concept and basic pillars of FOIP have remained unchanged. Quoting Prime Minister Kishida from his speech in India last year, FOIP is a vision to enhance the connectivity of the Indo-Pacific region, to foster the region into a place that values freedom, the rule of law, free from force or coercion, and make it prosperous. Collectively, then, we can summarize the objective of FOIP as aiming for a world where diverse nations can coexist and prosper together under the rule of law. But this effort cannot be done by one country alone. Achieving FOIP's objectives require the efforts of like-minded countries. This has not been difficult, as Japan's very first partner in adopting a FOIP strategy of its own was its ally, the United States. In subsequent years, Japan and the United States have worked together to strengthen their coordination with other like-minded states. Through individual efforts as well as those coordinated bilaterally, and in some cases multilaterally, the United States and Japan and a growing list of countries together face the challenges and expand cooperation for the benefit of the Indo-Pacific region. While it's not a requirement today to know the history of FOIP and how it came into being, its usage has proliferated and become common parlance. As such, there's no doubt many questions on what it is, what kind of policies have been adopted as part of it, and what other countries' view of it. And that brings us to today's event. The interest of the RAND Corporation to co-host an event like this is with Japan's Consulate General in LA and the Japan House Los Angeles fits squarely within our organization's goals. The RAND Corporation is a nonprofit research organization that develops solutions to public policy challenges to help make communities throughout the world safer and more secure and more prosperous. That is exactly why we are co-hosting this event today. With a stated focus to help improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis, hosting an event like today offers us an opportunity to deep dive into FOIP and ask questions of experts to better understand the full contours of this idea that has framed the way that we think about the region. Importantly, while the focus of today's event is on FOIP, we are also highlighting the alliance between the United States and Japan and the numerous partnerships that the alliance pursues to cooperate towards a more free and open region. Today's event is meant to bring together experts from different organizations in both the United States and Japan, as well as like-minded countries, to get a better understanding of this ever-expanding concept and what the future may hold. But before we get into the meat of the conference today, let me highlight that today marks the 10th anniversary of working closely together with Japan's Consulate General in Los Angeles. Over the past 10 years, we've examined so many important topics in our alliance. And as successful as this partnership has been, it grew to include Japan House Los Angeles after Japan House was established, allowing our events an even larger platform in the Los Angeles area. So let me take a moment first to express my profound gratitude and thanks to the partnership that RAND has with the Consulate and Japan House. We are honored at RAND to continue to have a great relationship with such stellar partners, allowing us to convene some of the best experts in the field to discuss some of the biggest topics that are facing our two countries. And so in that vein, let me turn to each of our co-hosts to offer a few comments before opening up the first panel. And I will start with Consul General Sone Kenko. Consul General Sone has an impressive background in the foreign ministry, which he entered in 1989. Over the years, he has not only held numerous overseas positions in India, Switzerland, and 2 stints at the embassy in Washington, D.C. He has also held numerous posts in Tokyo, including in the North American Affairs Bureau, the Asian and Oceanian Affairs Bureau, and the Economic Affairs Bureau. His immediate postings prior to joining us here in the United States were that of Assistant Minister, Director General for Cultural Affairs, held concurrently with being Ambassador in charge of Sport and Budo. Consul General Sone, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kenko Sone, Consul General of Japan at Los Angeles. Thank you for coming, those distinguished speakers and panelists, and for joining us all the way from Washington or Tokyo. And also, I first would like to express my appreciation to the RAND Corporation and this Japan-US Alliance series for inviting these wonderful experts from both sides of the Pacific to discuss this important topic of realizing free and open Indo-Pacific. As Jeff mentioned, that this year we marked the 10th year anniversary of this U.S. Japan Alliance series. Over the past 10 years, U.S. Japan Alliance series has explored a wide range of important issues and themes, and this series is essential for promoting dialogue and deepening understanding about the complex issues. I greatly appreciate your hard work. And by the way, 10 years ago, in 1914, I was working in the Prime Minister's office dealing with international communications, so I might be the person who's been involved in starting this program. So I was really happy to be here to celebrating this 10 years anniversary as well. And Japan-US relations is, of course, is very stronger than ever. Yet we find ourselves at the turning point of the history with the global security environment in the precarious situations. At the time when the Indo-Pacific region faces mounting challenges to the rule-based international order, dialogue by experts regarding Japan-US partnership and cooperation with other like-minded countries to address these challenges will be very critical. So close cooperation between Japan, US, and other like-minded countries will be a cornerstone of realizing the free and open Indo-Pacific. So I'm very much looking forward to all the discussions today for the better understanding of these complex issues and situations in this region and implication for our future. And eventually, I hope you will take away the importance and how we can work together to make the world better, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Consul General Sone. Our next speaker is President of the Japan House, Los Angeles, Kaifu Yuko. President Kaifu, thank you for hosting us at such a beautiful venue. We have the Hollywood stars right outside, and you can see everybody getting ready for the big event next week. I do not want to stand here in the Japan House before the President of the Japan House and tell you what the Japan House does. I will leave that to President Kaifu. What I can say, for those of you who do not already know, the Japan House Los Angeles is a gem of an institution. And for those of you who live here in Los Angeles, very fortunate to have this institution here, as there are only 3 of them in the world. President Kaifu joined the Japan House Los Angeles in January 2016 to start up the organization. She started her career at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and had assignments that included the Embassy of Japan in Canada, the Consulate General in Los Angeles, and various departments in Tokyo. After leaving government service, President Kaifu worked at the Japanese American National Museum as its vice president, and later at MUFG Union Bank as managing director of corporate communications. Again, we are very fortunate to have President Kaifu lead such an impressive organization to help showcase the best Japan has to offer. And it is my pleasure to welcome President Kaifu for some remarks.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for the very kind introduction and also for promoting Japan House, LA. Good morning, everyone. I wish to thank you so very much for joining us today. I hope you didn't have any trouble finding your way and parking downstairs because, as Jeffrey was talking about, the Academy Award will be taking place right here at Dolby Theater on the 10th of March, and they're hard at work getting ready. So it's almost like you could see the making of the Academy Awards ceremony. But I know that I see some familiar faces, so I'm sure that some of you have visited us and participated in our past programs. But for those of you who who's never visited here before today, Japan House is a global public diplomacy project and initiative launched by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan under the Abe administration to showcase the best of Japan, ranging from art and culture to design, fashion, gastronomy, business promotion, regional promotion, and entertainment, films and music and all the others, but also includes public policy programs, which is really what we are showcasing today. As Jeffrey mentioned, Japan House is located in 3 locations in the world: London, Sao Paulo, and Los Angeles. Why did the government choose the United States? It's a no-brainer because the U.S. Japan relationship is the most important bar none. So we're happy to be here. We opened our doors in the summer, August 2018, and we are doing all kinds of programs. Of course, we do have this multi-purpose hall, library, restaurant. On the 2nd floor, we do have a gallery and the shop, so which opens till 7 p.m. That if you have a chance to visit there, please make sure. Now, of course, the Consulate General of Japan and RAND Corporations has been partnering to host these important public policy programs over 10 years now. And we're a newcomer, so we're like baby partner. But over the last 2 years or so, we've been carrying out a few programs, both online and on-site, but all the on-site programs have been taking place on the campus of RAND. So this is really the first time that we are co-presenting this important program at Japan House. So we're very lucky and delighted to have such a distinguished group of speakers, some of whom flew in from Japan and flew in from the East Coast, Washington, D.C. primarily. So I'm very happy and looking forward. And as I said, on the second floor, we do have an exhibition called Design Museum Japan, which features design in daily lives in Japan, picking up 6 locations in Japan. So at the end of the day, your mind, brain has been working, and intellectual knowledge is all about your brain, but you probably want to relax going to the exhibition. So I hope you visit us and visit for many more events in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, President Kaifu. So let me now turn to the main proceedings, starting with a few administrative remarks. Audience members online, please submit questions through the Q&A function, which we will monitor and select from. Please indicate to whom you are posing your question if you are posing it to a specific speaker. We do anticipate a large number of questions. We will only have a limited amount of time to answer them. So apologies if we do not get to your question online. And then finally, for all of you in person and online, we will be sending you a short questionnaire about the conference after the event today. It takes about 2 minutes to fill out. And it helps us identify future topics and improve how we do our event and just try to make it better for the future. So we would be very grateful if you could take 2 minutes of your time when you get that link and fill that out. But with that, let me ask my 3 panelists to please come up on stage, and I will introduce them and we will get started. So it's my pleasure to begin today's proceedings by welcoming the first panel, which is titled "The Security Dimensions of FOIP: Is Conflict Inevitable?" For this, we have assembled 3 excellent speakers to help us understand what Japan has done, as well as what countries like the United States and China think about FOIP. I will not provide their full bios, but I do encourage you to look at our event page online to learn more about their research interests and their backgrounds. But I will provide just a very brief bio of each. We will begin today's session with Dr. Ken Jimbo, who is both a professor of international relations at Keio University and a managing director of programs at the International House of Japan. Dr. Jimbo is also an adjunct senior research fellow at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies, and he has served as an advisor for various Japanese governmental commissions and research groups. Our next speaker will be Mr. Christopher Johnstone, who is senior advisor and Japan chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining CSIS, Mr. Johnstone served in the United States government for 25 years in a variety of senior positions, including twice on the National Security Council as Director for East Asia under President Biden and Director for Japan and Oceanian Affairs under President Obama. In the Department of Defense's Office of the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Johnstone also led offices with responsibility for South and Southeast Asia and for East Asia. During this time, he served as Director for Northeast Asia, where he had principal responsibilities for developing strategy for the U.S. Japan alliance. Our final speaker will be Ms. Kristen Gunnis, who is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Ms. Gunnis has worked with a range of U.S. Department of Defense and private sector clients throughout her career and advised senior leaders in the United States Navy, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the intelligence community. Before she joined us at RAND, Ms. Gunnis served as the Director of Navy Asia Pacific Advisory Group at the Pentagon, where she advised the Chief of Naval Operations on security and foreign policy trends in the Indo-Pacific region, with a focus on Chinese maritime strategy and naval capabilities. And even before that, she was a senior project director on Chinese military and security affairs at the Center for Naval Analysis. So with that, I will turn over first to Dr. Jimbo, and you can speak at the podium or speak at your chair, whichever.
All right, should I sit down here? Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking RAND Corporation, Japan Consul General in LA, and Japan House for organizing this wonderful event. It's my first time to come to Japan House. I'm very excited to see all the ambience in the Hollywood. This session focus is the security and defense domain dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. As Jeff has already kindly introduced, where does this concept come from and how it has been embedded as one of the pillar strategy in Japan and also in the United States. But let me just go through my slides to highlight the relevance of Indo-Pacific as a main focal point of our national security strategy and what could be the implication for the U.S. Japan security relations. There has been I think a rise and fall of various regional concepts in the past decades of the Japanese diplomacy. Back in 1980s and 90s, we mainly focus on the Asia Pacific as a benchmarking regional concepts, as we have like Asia Pacific economic cooperation mechanisms. And everybody wished to be plug and play into the rise of East Asian economy for several decades. But in 1990s, with experiencing the Asian financial crisis, especially in Southeast Asia, Korea, Indonesia, and Thailand, there has been a rise of East Asia as an alternative concept as we develop our own mechanism of the financial rescue plans and Chenma initiative, currency swap mechanisms in order to provide the short-term rescue funds among ourselves. And we found ourselves that East Asia has also become a very, I think, important unit for the political and economic cooperation within our regions. But in 2000 and the 2010s, there has been the need for so-called institutional balancing by looking at ever rising China as huge regional players. So East Asia is a bit short of having a kind of more like a balancing coordination mechanism. We definitely need to find some big players to balance the influence of China. Here comes the United States once again as a player in the East Asian Summit. And also in terms of the internal cooperation mechanism, we also asked Russia to be part of it. I thought that was a mistake, but in 2010, we incorporate Russia as also the part of the East Asian Summit as well. And then in 2010s, the Indo-Pacific came into play as a dominating regional concept in Japan and also followed by the United States. And I think that has lots of context. And one is the opportunity side. Obviously, there has been the huge distribution of power in the emerging economies in Indo-Pacific. India as one of the benchmarking country, but also the whole South Asia as a region, Middle East, Eastern Africa, and that has been the epicenter of the future growth in the world economy. Everybody wished to be part of those economic dynamism. That's number one. But by looking at those kind of the rim of the coastal areas in the Indo-Pacific, they are prone to many of the regional rivalry tensions and the conflicts. And we definitely need to embrace those kind of opportunity and dealing with those challenges where those Indo-Pacific has become the strategic concept for Japan and many of those countries. And then as Jeff mentioned in 2016, that former Prime Minister Abe has identified this should be officialized regional concept for the Japanese diplomacy. We are very glad that the United States have also officialized this concept in 2017. And I believe that Chris was in the government during that stage, so that we have to know about all those kind of internal stories about how the Indo-Pacific has shaped its U.S. foreign policy during that stage. But in terms of how we deal with Indo-Pacific, I think there's two categories in dealing with it. One definitely is a competitive strategy, how we can really sustain the status quo in Asia by having a more like a like-minded states coalition to balance against those kind of change of the distribution of power in the region. And that is also being applied to the economic domain, which we're going to discuss this afternoon as well. But that entails, as Jeff mentioned, how we can really collaborate and cooperate within those regions. So it's a kind of combination of the competitive strategy and the cooperation strategy within the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And by looking at how we can really decipher the competitive and cooperation elements in the Indo-Pacific strategy, you can find more in the national security strategy and national defense strategy that we adopted in December 2022. That's by the way, that's a phenomenal document in the post-war Japanese history, by knowing that you can see the highlights, like we have decided to double the size of the defense budget until 2027. We also decided to procure lots of like weapon systems and equipment, which was unprecedented in our post-war history. That really represents the competitive elements in how we deal with Indo-Pacific in coming decades. By looking at importance of the U.S. Japan alliance as ever heightened importance in dealing not only with a low-end, medium-end escalation of the conflicts, but we are dealing with a potential situation in the Taiwan Straits or the Korean Peninsula, which entails a lots of potential for the crisis escalation into the high end. So we definitely need to prepare for such kind of escalatory scenario for the future. And in that context, we also have to strengthen ties with the like-minded states beyond the United States, where Australia, Southeast Asia, India all comes into play as a like-minded coalition. And those are the parts of the competitive strategy that we are going to pursue. But also, I also like to highlight, which has not been, I think, aware by many, that the FOIP has a lots of like a collaboration, cooperation plan as a main focal point of what we want to proceed in coming years, and that really has been highlighted by, as Jeff introduced, that the new plans for FOIP in the Kishida administration, which has been delivered in his speech in India March last year, which I'm going to come to a little bit of the detail in the later slides. When you look at the sequence of how the distribution of power has been transcended over past years, which is phenomenal, but because when you look at this is by the way, that each country's defense budget in US dollar terms. Back in 2005, you can find that the defense budget of Japan and military budget of China was almost equalized, right, in the US dollar terms. But in 2020, China has already become like 5 times bigger than the Japanese defense budget. If we keep ourselves 1% of the GDP size in coming decades, that's going to be 1 to 9, 1 to 10 time of the gap that we have vis-a-vis China. So this is the kind of the scale of the gap, the widening gap that we have between Japan and China. So definitely we need to chase the kind of the moving targets of what kind of status quo management we can do by having such kind of the reality of the gap that we have with China. And then the double size of the defense budget will create some kind of closing of the gap, but doesn't really have the systemic difference between, what really constitutes the difference between Japan and China. So what we are trying to achieve in the, national defense strategy, this is too much of what you can find in the slides. And I think that for Chris, this is a very familiar. This is what the Chris has worked on in his office. But to summarize it, I think that Japan decided to procure the capability that aims to deny the Chinese prospect of the operational success in wherever that the China tried to focus for like a Taiwan contingency or Senkaku, South China Sea. We're not really trying to match up the same capability with China to create the kind of stalemate situation in the balance of power, but we are probably try to procure the capability that is enough to deny the Chinese prospect or the calculation of the operational success. And this is how the so-called deterrence by denial try to take place. And this is how we are trying to seriously invest for the coming decades. So that's pretty much the competitive part of what we are trying to have. And let me also explain a bit about the cooperation part in the security domain of how Japan tried to pursue its Indo-Pacific strategy by looking at the Kishida speech in the March 2023. You can find that there's lots of emphasis on how we try to pursue the Indo-Pacific as a region which has an inclusiveness. And you can find lots of like differences of the political systems, economic stages, and how they govern themselves. And definitely as Jeff, Consul General mentioned that we try to attain the region, which is rule-based, and then, the principle-based, and to pursue a more free and open economic and political, order in the region. But at the same time, what you can find, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you can find more like a cohesiveness in the Western system, like a NATO and EU, but such kind of cohesiveness does not really include those emerging powers in the world. The country who joined in the economic sanction against Russia is only like 38 states. And people wish to be part of those kind of principle-based kind of international order, but not at the level they sacrifice their actual economic gains and political gains in that transaction. So definitely we need to approach to those who are not in line with those G7 plus types of the agenda, and that has to be filled by our own approach in the FOIP. And this is what I think Kishida tried to approach in the March speech in India. So our FOIP means that everybody doesn't really claim the copyrights of the FOIP. We are one of the initiator of the FOIP, but Japan does not claim this is a Japanese FOIP, you have to subscribe it, and that's not our approach. We are trying to appeal that everybody can claim the copyright of the FOIP, because I think everybody has a very different priorities by looking at this vast region. So this is my final 2 slides, and this is the 51 items of the cooperation that we outlined. That's very Japanese style. I mean, it's a very detailed, like a cooperation. And I will characterize this is like a bazaar diplomacy. We have lots of like boutiques and shops of the cooperation. And for those, the countries in Indo-Pacific, everybody can subscribe or, follow on to our proposal without any ideological strings attached. In that context, we are even try to differentiate ourselves probably from the Washington, D.C. And we are independently try to engage, sometimes together with the United States, but sometimes separate from the United States, because we are here to fill the gap of the difference in the Indo-Pacific. And here's a menu that you can really have from appetizer to the desserts. And those are currently our approach to the Indo-Pacific. And what could be the security domain? That this is my last slide, and I'll finish my talk. And in addition to what I mentioned about importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance, like-minded states, there are lots of, I think, I would call it soft approaches, and create the kind of the foundation of the cooperation by providing the funds by the new official security assistance. This is not the official development assistance, but end user will be the military security sectors, but we are able to finance it for the capacity building, infrastructure financing, probably in Southeast Asia as a starting point, but also beyond. And also the lots of capacity building types of the collaboration between the militaries. And those are something that we are going to deal with it. Eventually, we are also wish to expand our arms sales markets from the Japanese defense industries to others. That's really unprecedented. We have already relaxed our standards 10 years ago, same time that you started those programs. That we have relaxed the standards of the weapons equipment transfer programs, but the successful cases that we have was only one. So that's a radar transfer to the Philippines. So we wish to have a more successful cases in the region to become one of the main players in these fields in order to create the kind of foundation of the security cooperation in this region. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thought I'd use the podium. I've noticed how everyone who speaks right after Jeffrey has to adjust the height of the microphone. But thank you, Jeffrey, for this opportunity to be here today. Thank you to the Consulate General of Los Angeles, and thank you to Japan House for what a wonderful venue and an opportunity to get outside of Washington for me. So I very much appreciate this. I'm going to try to do three things in my time here, building on the really impressive remarks that Jimbo Sensei laid out for us. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of Japan in America's strategy toward the Indo-Pacific and America's own concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific. I'm going to talk about the main elements of US strategy toward the region, and then I'll close with a couple of comments about China, which hopefully will set the stage for Kristen as we move through this. So the first point to make is I cannot overstate the critical role that Japan plays in US policy toward the Indo-Pacific region. From a US perspective, the relationship with Japan has never been stronger. I've been around this relationship for 30 plus years, and it has become really the foundation of everything that the United States seeks to do and accomplish in the Indo-Pacific region across almost every issue you can think of, geopolitical, economic, other global issues. The US and Japan are very closely aligned, not completely aligned, but extremely closely aligned. And when you think about the main issues in Asia, whether it's the rise of China, North Korean provocations, the war in Ukraine, Japan plays a critical role. Bilateral irritants have largely disappeared, right? When I first started working on this relationship, trade friction dominated the headlines. That's largely gone. In my work at the White House, I had the opportunity to join two meetings that President Biden had with Prime Minister Kishida, and I was struck by how little they talked about US-Japan issues and how much they focused on what we're doing together in the region and beyond. And that's a reflection of the fact that Japan is stepping up in ways that were really unimaginable a few years ago, spending more on defense, as Jimbo Sensei said, providing robust support to Ukraine, frankly, something we didn't expect when I was in the White House, leading on free trade at a time that the United States is receding into isolationism on the trade front. So there's a lot that Japan is bringing to the table. And there was a time not all that long ago when there would have been some discomfort, frankly, in Washington with this increasingly large role that Japan is playing. But those days are gone. And indeed, the United States, as Jimbo Sensei said, has come to use Japan's language deliberately. The first line of the second chapter of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy says that the United States is committed to an Indo-Pacific that is free and open. That's no accident. That's a deliberate echoing of Japan's own framing. And Prime Minister Kishida is about to come to the White House for a big visit in April, and I think that will very much showcase the importance of this relationship to the United States. So let me turn now to talk about U.S. security strategy toward the region. And I think one of the themes you will see is that Japan is central to all of it. I think there are three broad elements, and I'll talk about each of them in turn, again, on the security side. The first element is a very strong focus on strengthening U.S. bilateral alliances in the region. The so-called thickening of the spokes is what I like to say. So as people here probably know, the United States has 5 treaty alliances, 5 bilateral treaty alliances in Asia. Unlike in Europe where we have NATO, they're all bilateral. Australia, Japan, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea, and Thailand. And really, with the exception of Thailand, which is a slightly different relationship, all of these alliances are getting stronger at the same time. I would argue that it's the first time that that's been the case since at least the end of the Cold War. And that's not because of some magical Biden administration diplomacy or special sauce. There are a number of factors that behind the strengthening of these alliances. Some as a result of individual leaders like Marcos in the Philippines, President Yoon in South Korea, Prime Minister Kishida in Japan. But really the key underlying component is a converging sense of threat and concern about PRC, Chinese actions and behavior in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Now, as you look across these alliances, there are variations in the degree to which they're responding to that challenge. I would argue that Japan's trajectory is the most dramatic, as the 2022 National Security Strategy indicates, big increases in defense spending, investments in new capabilities, and so on. The Philippines might be the most recent and the least expected of these relationships that are strengthening, but they're all moving, I think, in the same direction toward greater solidarity. And all of these relationships have been supported by a Biden administration approach that I would argue is different from the past. It's not just about saying that alliances are good and important to the United States, which is true. There's been a consistent and I think focused effort to support US allies in becoming more powerful and capable themselves. So you see this in the decision to provide nuclear powered submarines to Australia. First time we've done that since the 1950s. You see that in the decision to sell Tomahawk cruise missiles to Japan, a very significant decision by the United States. Lifting of restrictions on South Korean missile forces. All of these things point to a conscious effort to strengthen the capabilities and power, military power, frankly, of allies in a way that I would argue is new. Second part of the strategy relates to building minilateralism and promoting ties among US allies in the region. In other words, moving away from this bilateral focus. And I think there are 2 dimensions to this, minilateralism that includes the United States and minilateralism that doesn't include the United States. And both are happening in very interesting ways. On the former, you see the rise of mechanisms like the U.S. Japan-Australia relationship, the U.S. Japan-South Korea relationship, which has really taken off in the last year or so. These mechanisms of cooperation among the 3 partners in each have existed in the past, but in the past they were largely photo ops. I was part of a meeting in 2015 among the leaders at the time, President Obama, Prime Minister Abe, and then Prime Minister Abbott in Australia, and it was largely a photo op, a nice conversation and a picture. Now there's concrete agendas underneath each of these. Real on the defense side, exercises and training, for example, Japanese F-35s flying to Australia for training and vice versa. A host of things that Japan and South Korea are now doing trilaterally with the United States on exercises, information sharing, and cooperation in other areas. So meaningful minilateral cooperation that involves the United States. And then allies of the United States strengthening cooperation among themselves that doesn't necessarily involve us at all. And I point in particular to Japan's recent agreements with Australia, with the United Kingdom, work with the Philippines toward an access agreement for Japanese military exercises. And my hope is over the next year, perhaps real bilateral progress in the Japan-South Korea relationship as well. And then on top of this, you have the emergence of brand new structures like the Quad, as Jimbo Sensei mentioned, a systematic effort to engage India and bring India into the East Asian conversation. So I think what's key here is that the US role is important, but there's an organic sense to this development, an organic sense of growing cooperation among countries with common interests and common concerns. Finally, on US strategy, an effort to deepen cross-region linkages. So by that, I mean, particularly between Europe and US alliances in Asia. This administration has been very explicit about its effort to do this. The AUKUS partnership with Australia and the UK on submarines is the one recent example of this, but you also, for example, have Indo-Pacific leaders from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand attending the NATO summit on an annual basis. That's a new development. Contributions by both Japan and the ROK to Ukraine have been extraordinary. And you now see also routine deployments, Navy deployments on the part of countries like the UK, Germany, France, others to the Indo-Pacific. So a conscious effort to build ties across regions. And I think Prime Minister Kishida has been quite powerful in talking about the importance of this. His famous speech, the famous line in his speech in Singapore in 2022, when he said, Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow, this idea that our security is connected. So let me close with a couple of lines on China. So the purpose of all this, right? Why are we doing all this? Why do we have strengthening bilateral alliances, minilateralism, the rise of cross-regional linkages? A lot of this, of course, is driven by the China challenge. This administration describes China as a revisionist power, one that seeks to alter the international order to advance its interests. The US national security strategy says, quote, the PRC is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to advance that objective. So US policy and this security strategy that I've been talking about really seeks to prevent China from being able to do that, preventing China from being able to upend the international order and the existing norms and institutions that we've built since the end of World War II. So on the defense front, you have this alliance cooperation I've talked about and steps that America itself is taking. On the economic side, you see a more systematic effort to protect and promote critical technologies and address unfair trade practices. In the developing world, you see an effort to offer alternatives to authoritarianism. I think there is a recognition in the United States that China will be powerful for a long time, that the United States and China must learn to live together, to occupy the same planet. As competition is not conflict. I think that's a belief that is truly held in the White House. And so the US seeks a China that is deterred from major aggression, particularly from Taiwan, unable to coerce allies and like-minded partners in ways that are not, that are disadvantageous to their sovereignty, but one where we can cooperate on areas of common purpose. And Jeffrey mentioned climate change, counter-drug work, a number of areas where certainly there's a hope to cooperate with China. But the underlying assumption is that strategic competition between the US and China is a long-term reality. And the security strategy that I've described, built around the relationship with Japan, reflects that reality. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for that perfect segue into talking about China. Unlike my esteemed co-panelists, I am a China expert, not a Japan expert. So I'm going to be talking about China's perspective on FOIP and China's security strategy in the Indo-Pacific, what kind of relationship China wants from Japan, How does China view the U.S. Japan alliance and all of those types of issues? So I'll touch on those issues, and then we can talk more in the discussion. But first, I did want to thank again the Consul General and the Japan House for having me here, and Jeffrey for having me at this important event. So the first point I want to make is that FOIP really represents a competing vision to that of China's in the Indo-Pacific region. One can view China's Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, launched in 2013, as a key element of China's global and grand strategy. It's not the only element, but it's one of the manifestations of it. The BRI had been widely recognized as Beijing's strategy to reshape and dominate the regional and international order by building infrastructure networks across Eurasia and Eastern Africa, though it's now been replaced more recently by China's Global Security Initiative and the Global Development Initiative, which is less reliant on heavy infrastructure construction, but still focused on using China's economic clout to build influence in key areas. From the perspective of the U.S.-Japan alliance, Japan's FOIP vision can be really seen as a strategic countermeasure against the Chinese BRI and a framework for broader regional security architecture that is different from either China's Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative. So these are sort of two different competing strategic visions. The second point is that FOIP's emphasis on freedom of movement and connectivity within the region really highlights that the US and Japan on one side and China on the other have different regional and operational visions. The United States and Japan's vision really focuses on freedom of movement, as we've heard, and freedom of action in international waters, for example, to protect US, Japanese, and other allied and partner interests. China's vision is to ensure that basically no potentially hostile foreign military, especially that of the United States, can operate in the vicinity of mainland China with impunity, and that no military can engage the PLA or intervene in its operations without confronting risk. So China's actions have increasingly been aimed at restricting freedom of movement in international and territorial waters and airspace, as demonstrated by China's maritime gray zone operations and maritime air incursions into Japan's maritime and airspace around the Senkaku Islands, as an example. So these are obviously two very different competing strategic and regional visions, and I think that FOIP emphasizes this contrast in a good way. So given this contrast in visions, what's China's perspective of the security aspect of FOIP? So the security aspect of FOIP, from what I understand, can be bent into three areas. First is securing freedom of navigation. Second is promoting regional resiliency and connectivity. And third is rulemaking and norm setting. So while the United States and Japan's actions in these areas are nothing new, from China's perspective, each of these areas has the potential to increasingly impact on Chinese interests. And this includes territorial interests in the East and South China Seas, China's attempts to unilaterally change the status quo on freedom of navigation in the maritime domain and in other areas such as cyberspace, and China's perceived status as the top regional power, given FOIP's emphasis on, again, growing interconnectivity between countries in the region and strengthening the capacity of regional partners, including the Philippines, for example, which has been dealing with China's coercive actions in the South China Sea and around the Second Thomas Shoal. So from this standpoint, FOIP is concerning to Beijing because it's one element of a stronger U.S.-Japan alliance. And if the implementation of FOIP is successful, China might be facing a regional environment that is less conducive to maintaining and expanding its interests, both territorial, economic, and in terms of regional influence. So this leads to the question of how China views the U.S.-Japan alliance. And to get to that question, I have to talk for a minute about how China views the US-led alliance structure in general. So generally, China views the US-led alliance structure as inherently zero-sum, and they talk about this and they write about this, meant to contain China and augment US regional hegemony. So from Beijing's perspective, these alliances are relics of the Cold War and indicative of US thinking because the US relied on alliances during the Soviet era. And so there used to be a time when China thought that it received some benefits from the US-led alliance structure in Asia. And now that has really shifted to the perspective that the system does not favor China and is not friendly to Chinese objectives and those of developing countries. So China really views the U.S. alliances in the region very negatively and does what it can to create fissures between the U.S. and its allies and partners. And the primary means it has done this is through economics, money and investments, and particularly in Southeast Asian countries, which are very reliant on trade with China and wary of the potential for economic retaliation against them if they are viewed as obstructing Chinese interests or cooperating too closely with the United States and allies. So against this backdrop, how does China view the U.S.-Japan alliance? Under the Xi administration, Xi Jinping, Beijing's opposition to the strengthening of the U.S.-Japan alliance has been pretty explicit. Once seen as a valued restraint that checked Japan's ambitions for regional hegemony, for example, the U.S.-Japan alliance is now viewed by Beijing as rather a threat. Xi Jinping has gone beyond calls for the elimination of such alliances in the Asia-Pacific and has proposed the establishment of these new regional security architectures, such as the GSI. Another criticism from Chinese officials is that the China threat is being used by Japan as an excuse for military expansion with the goal of developing defense capabilities independent from the United States. And another perspective from China that we see and hear about in Chinese literature is that the United States not only enables, but also encourages Japan to adopt offensive military capabilities and policies countering China, which contributes to US efforts to contain China. So these are all sort of threads of discussion that we see in official remarks coming from China, as well as in Chinese commentary and the literature that we see from China. So the perceived threat from a closer US-Japan alliance in terms of what China has done about it has led China to conduct some actions that I would think have arguably pushed Tokyo closer to Washington. Some of these examples include increased gray zone operations against Japan, focused on the territorial interests in the Senkakus in particular. And for example, last year, banning Japanese seafood. But despite this, China would also like to maintain an economic and political relationship to Japan that can act as a counterweight to the United States and US influence. So for example, Xi Jinping has also tried to reaffirm relations with Prime Minister Kishida, likely in an effort to try and drive a wedge between Japan and the United States by establishing a more strategic relationship with Japan amid the US-China competition. So these are all sort of a conglomeration of actions that China is taking in response to what it perceives as a strengthening US-Japan relationship. And some of these actions clearly run counter to others. So I'm not entirely sure that Beijing has a very coherent strategy when it comes to Japan, but it's sort of trying different angles. Beyond the US-Japan alliance, China also views Japan's actions with other countries in the regions as concerning, particularly if those actions could lead to the potential formation of an anti-China coalition. So FOIP's emphasis on regional connectivity and cooperation on a range of important issues is likely a concerning element to China. And here's where I think China's been watching the Russia-Ukraine conflict to see how well the United States has been able to shore up and maintain support for Ukraine with allies and partners, despite an increasingly lengthy and costly conflict, and where China might be watching Japan for indications of greater support for the United States should we, hopefully this never happens, but should we enter into a conflict over Taiwan, for example. This has already been spoken about by the other panelists, but one example of a regional minilateral grouping that concerns China is the Quad, which involves the US, India, Japan, and Australia, and has provoked a number of reactions from China, although most of these have been in the diplomatic protests and some maritime military exercises following the Quad exercises. But basically, the Chinese reaction stemmed from perceptions of a hostile United States, heightened threat perception likely owing to the geographic position of member countries and their potential combined military power, and the possibility of eroding Chinese influence in the region. Interestingly, tensions over the Quad's activities have also coincided with an intensification of disputes between Beijing and each of the Quad member countries. So for example, we can look to China's disputes with India, the border disputes that have happened over the last several years as an example of that. And that likely exacerbates China's threat perceptions about the Quad and accelerates momentum toward enhanced cooperation among Quad members. So this is another area where Beijing might be concerned by Japan's relationship with other countries in the region. as well as Japan's leadership in addressing security issues with regional partners. These are the perceptions and reactions on China's part about FOIP, the state of the U.S.-Japan alliance, and how Beijing might perceive that both of these issues impact Chinese interests. There are some implications I just wanted to point out, and then we can talk about them in the Q&A. One implication is that we need to continue to work together to strengthen deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region and demonstrate commitment to upholding the international order and norms in the maritime domain. So this is an area where the United States and Japan militaries can work together with Asian partners and allies to strengthen their maritime capabilities. For example, by conducting more multilateral exercises or training with Japan, the Philippines, and other ASEAN states to augment capabilities. And along with that point, US and Japanese activities with allies and partners that message strong regional relationships is really crucial to deterring China. The messaging and public profile that accompanies security assistance activities or military activities with partners and allies should emphasize the strength of bilateral or multilateral defense relationships. A second implication is that China's military rise and coercive actions in the Indo-Pacific created an opportunity for the United States and Japan to collaborate on fostering more multilateral dialogue and connections between Asian countries on security issues of concern, like freedom of navigation, exclusive economic zones, and fishing rights and maritime resources, as well as related to other important security challenges. For example, in the information and cyberspace area. So I think in some ways, China's reactions provide a foundation for augmenting the FOIP concept within the region. And then the last implication that I'll talk about is that the United States and Japan should focus on greater coordination with countries that also provide security assistance to the region. And this has already been mentioned by the others, but this includes Australia and India to help build security relationships in Southeast Asia, for example. And I know Japan has already been doing this, a lot of work on this with the Philippines, which is great. So I realized that my talk might have sounded negative. I also don't believe conflict is inevitable, but I do think we are facing some collective challenges, and that FOIP is a great step in the right direction in terms of promoting the types of relationships and multilateralism and interconnectivity that would be very helpful in the US-China competition and with China in general. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 30 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions for the panelists. I would ask if you have a question, start thinking about it. We'll leave some time here. And also for those of you who are watching online, please submit your question. Colleague at RAND is going to be helping me monitor those. So let me start with asking all three of you, I guess, starting with Chris and Ken. You both explained how Japan and the United States view FOIP. You both kind of touched on that there are differences in US FOIP and Japan FOIP. And so the question I want to ask both of you is, what are those differences? Like, are there significant differences in America's FOIP and Japan's FOIP, or is it just differences on the margins? And for Kristen, I'd like to ask you a question about, Ken was mentioning in his talk how a lot of countries have adopted similar FOIPs or FOIP-like strategies. We also have a lot of Indo-Pacific strategies. What does China make of this growing list of countries, not just in the region, but out of the region, UK, for example, that have adopted either an Indo-Pacific strategy or a FOIP-like approach to the region? How does China view that growing list of countries that have developed that? So let me start with Ken, and then we'll just go down the line here.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I think we've heard that the context of how the FOIP has been formulated, and you heard a lot about United States and China has become a strategic competitor, especially after the 2017 National Security Strategy. They have been clearly identified China as a revisionist, and the United States and China has been in the long term of the competitions that needs to be pursued. But most interestingly, what happened in 2018, 19, 20 was the period Japan tried to engage China amid those umbrella of the strengthening of the U.S. Japan coordination vis-a-vis China. Remember, Abe visited China October 2018 to pursue the cooperation. When the Trump administration calling China as a competitor, we called China as a collaborator. So it's a kind of interesting contrast between how we dealt with China during that stage by sharing a lot of concept of the competition, and especially shared a lots on the security and defense domain. But on the economy, still that 12,000 Japanese companies operating in China, many of them are making profits, and our profit return rates in Chinese market is much higher than any other markets in the world. And of course, that has lots of pessimistic prospects in the recent months because of the downturn of the Chinese economy. But still, we are lots of economically engaged in the Chinese market. Secondly, Abe administration, especially at the later stage, they tried to pursue the win-win solution with China by connecting the FOIP and even the BRI. And that failed, by the way. But still, that there's a lots of infrastructure needs in the Indo-Pacific. According to the ADB, that's trillions of US dollars will be the needs for the infrastructure development. And neither of the actor can afford such kind of needs individually. That has to be connected all together. For example, ADB and the Chinese AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, have a co-financing some of the projects in Pakistan and any others. And then everybody thought that that's really Chinese politically dominated financing programs. But I think by multilateralizing those financial schemes, China cannot really pursue their political ambition alone. And this is how we can really engage those types of the infrastructure financing by adding our own kind of a surveillance and the monitoring systems within those practices. So these are something kind of unique kind of a Japanese approach to China of some of those economic projects that we have. But after having those kind of initiation of those joint projects, we found out how difficult to work with China. And we have found out that there's like another 50 areas of cooperation in so-called the third party market cooperation mechanism between Japan and China. We identify several of the train projects, the railway projects and connectivity projects all pursued together. But many of them have not been going quite well because we do have a very different financial mechanism. We are much more like a private public coordination oriented type of the financing mechanism, whereas China has a much more national like a sovereign funds types of the financing mechanism, which have a more like the less tightened screening process how to play in the financing mechanism, whereas we've been very much embedded by the like a corporate governance type of system. So the concept has been pursued, but the reality is very much difficult to pursue on the way. So that those are the slightly differences that you can find on how the United States and Japan are approaching towards the mechanism. We do have a lot of commonality, but in the detail, there's a lot of differences.
Great, as usual, terrific remarks from Ken that I'll try to build on. I guess I would point to maybe 3 areas of not necessarily difference, but nuance and variation in how we think about this. First, just to build on Ken's comments on China. I think in some ways, Japan was ahead of the United States in recognizing and coming to terms with the country that China was becoming under Xi Jinping. I remember the first time I worked in the White House under President Obama, there were real differences between US and Japanese views on China. Japan was ahead of us in growing concern about the China challenge. And although US policy had begun to turn, we were toward a more sort of hard-edged approach to dealing with China. We weren't there yet, philosophically. So I think, to build on what you said, Ken, I think Japan has been comfortable for a longer period of time with the duality of the relationship with China. By duality, I mean the need for a more hard-edged security posture to deter, even as you seek to maintain economic ties where it makes sense to do so. And frankly, I don't think the American debate on this is resolved yet. I don't think we have yet figured out what the right balance is. And there's a very rigorous debate, as everyone here knows, on trade with China. What do we protect? What do we promote? What kinds of economic interaction are okay? What's not? So I do think the China issue is, we don't completely overlap on that yet. Second issue I'd point to is economic tools. There's a very strong economic dimension to Japan's FOIP that's sorely lacking, in my view, in the US concept. And some of this is a function of the authorities our governments have at their disposal to use. Japan has much more flexibility with economic assistance and infrastructure investment promotion, for example. We just don't have that in the same way. But I think, when I talk to counterparts around the region, they give a lot of credit to the security agenda of the United States. And I think the Biden administration deserves great credit for it. And they're very critical of US economic engagement in the region. And all that really stems in large part from the US withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the continued inability of the United States to have an effective trade and economic policy with the region. So that's a second area of difference. And the third I would point to, not a huge area of difference, I think it's a matter of emphasis, is governance. And that is to say, the United States continues as a matter of policy to speak out on issues of democracy and human rights, just part of our DNA, right? President Biden talks about democracy versus autocracy and the competition really between two visions of how people should live. And Japan is more, has a more nuanced approach, talking about the rule of law, the importance of certainly the importance of political rights and governance, but not in the same way that the United States approaches. So at times there are differences between the US and Japan on how to engage Cambodia, how to deal with the Myanmar problem, how to respond to some, threats to democracy elsewhere in the region. So there are differences on the margins, but I think in the main, we're aligned, and actually there's some complementarity. The fact that Japan does have a robust economic set of tools is a great complement to what the United States can bring to bear.
Yeah, thank you for that question. In terms of Chinese concerns, I would say as concerning to China as the minilateral groupings within the region are. It's also very concerning to China if countries from outside of the region start joining some of those policies and groupings. And so, yeah, I think China is worried about sort of how FOIP has expanded and how other countries are adopting it. And as part of that, they've continued to sort of put forward this global security development initiative, although it is still a little vague, but I think it's coalescing around more targeted and focused economic investments, in particular to build influence with some of those and relationships with some of those countries that it's concerned about, as well as increasing relations with ASEAN and things like that. So that's sort of how China's, I think, countering that. I think there's also a little bit of skepticism on in Beijing about, FOIP as a strategy seems pretty coherent, but it requires investments that some of which are being made. But I think there's a little bit of skepticism as to whether it will all actually come together in the way that is comprehensive and actionable to really do what it says it's going to do. So I think that's sort of on the other side, and they're watching and seeing how it develops and evolves.
Okay. Do we have questions in the audience? Yeah, okay, so we have a couple. So I would ask, please state your name, and also please be succinct in your question. and we can get more questions in. So we'll take, let's go with this gentleman here.
Hi, David Gooderman Organization. I sell insurance, broker international insurance. I'm interested in your perspectives. We've seen U.S. chips show up in Russian missiles and other Russian drones, whatnot, in Ukraine. I know that there's issues about US and Japanese technology ending up in Russia, but also in North Korea, which perhaps is a more imminent threat, and in China. And I'm interested in what you see Japan doing or not doing on that.
In terms of the export control of the critical technologies, we have been having the strong regulations over how those kind of private technologies will be transferred to those concerning states. And by looking at how North Korea especially try to produce their own technology, especially on the missiles, cybers, we know that they rely on the many of those commercial technologies to be, converged into those their equipments. And by looking at the details, some of the Japanese technologies have also been transferred covertly towards the North Korea, which concerns us a lot. So we've been, aware about those, the risks of those transferred technologies, which METI and our Japanese agencies are very, I think, strict upon how to regulate those technology transfers on the one stage. And secondly, by I mentioned about the promoting of the Japanese equipment transfer strategy, that's Japanese government is currently working on, but that is also under the strict control that this will be shared among those like-minded states, and then that should be the monitored, screened by through those kind of allies and like-minded states coordination processes. And that also should not be, transferred to those countries who are in those concerned states, especially in Russia and in North Korea, and also vis-a-vis China.
Chris, did you have a comment or no? Okay. I think a gentleman over here had a question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Cody, and I guess given the view that Ms. Gunnis gave us about China and whether the U.S. is actually a reliable partner in the trade policy area, and the chart that you put up that showed the massive, from my perspective, militarization of the Indo-Pacific region from all sides, what's the one thing that China could do and the one thing that the FOIP members could do to sort of de-escalate that? Because I came of age in the 80s where we, a lot of the energy was around disarmament, nuclear disarmament specifically, obviously, but it's quite alarming that one of the keystone elements of our posture right now is an increase in military capabilities with all partners in that region. And I'm not trying to promote a pro-Chinese perspective, but I can imagine that would be alarming to anyone. So what one thing could they do to sort of de-escalate that trajectory? And what's the one thing that the U.S. could do, U.S. Japan alliance could do to de-escalate that trajectory?
Maybe Chris and Kristen, would you each like to take that?
Yeah, I agree with you. It is the million-dollar question that that those of us who do China are asked a lot, which is how do you deter without creating a security dilemma, even more of one, and escalating. I do think that, and I say this a lot to folks, I do think that Xi Jinping oftentimes is playing to a domestic audience. There's a lot of domestic challenges that China has at home. And one of the reasons why, for example, he's reopened communication with President Biden and they've both tried on both sides, tried to stabilize the relationship from the tensions of the past year, has been because China needs a stable environment in which to continue to grow its economy, even while it's slowing. And so even though it doesn't necessarily need to have a great relationship with the United States, at least it has to have a stable one. And so this isn't necessarily an action, but I do think that continuing economic relations is very important, and also recognizing from the United States side, recognizing when Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping is really playing to a domestic audience in the rhetoric, and then it's not necessarily all directed at us, but he has to continue to have a strong persona for his domestic population and continue to do things that will allow his economy to grow and people's livelihoods to continue. So I think it's more of a recognition on both sides that sometimes rhetoric is rhetoric, and that we do have areas of common interest. We both want our economies to grow, for example, and I know we have an economic panel in the afternoon that can talk about that more.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess what I would say on the China side, I think I tried to make the point that all these alliances are getting stronger at the same time, but that's not because the Biden administration has some magic power that other administrations didn't have. It's because these countries are reacting to something. And that's something I think is an increasingly shared concern about China and China's actions in the region. So when you ask what could China do to sort of dial down the rhetoric or to sort of dial down the tensions, I point to a few things. I think when you look at each of U.S. partners around the region, China is taking an extraordinarily assertive approach in its relations with those countries. So there is a near daily presence of Chinese Coast Guard vessels around the Senkaku Islands near Japan. The ships are staying longer, they're getting bigger, and they're there every day. And there's been no change in that, despite the rhetoric from Beijing about, occasional rhetoric in Beijing about seeking a more stable relationship with Japan. With the Philippines, extraordinarily aggressive efforts to interfere with the Philippines' ability to access its own waters that are recognized as either sovereign Philippine waters or waters that are within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. With Australia, we still see aggressive approaches on the trade side from Beijing toward Australia. So to me, it starts with more calibration in how China approaches its partnerships. I think that has to be part of how we get to a more stable equilibrium, or U.S. relations are going to continue to strengthen as I've described. On the U.S. side, I do think this message of acknowledging that China is here to stay and that it's imperative that we find a way to coexist and mutually prosper. I think there was a period in U.S. policy where we got away a little bit from that message. I think you're hearing it much more. Jake Sullivan gave a talk at the Council on Foreign Relations not long ago where he really emphasized this theme of the need for coexistence. We both occupy this planet. And I think you've seen some movement in that direction. You've seen a reestablishment of diplomatic dialogue, of economic dialogue in various channels, even mill-to-mill dialogue. So the need to be able to communicate and cooperate where we can is something that the United States needs to constantly emphasize. And I think that's something that the Japanese side seeks to emphasize too.
Okay, I'm going to see if we have any online questions. Joan?
Yeah, so from Kinjiro Amano, we have a question of how could North Korea be involved in this matter? Would they work with China, and would we need to worry about it?
Increasingly concerning status on North Korea, and they have learned quite amount from how Russia try to deal with Ukraine crisis, especially utilization of the nuclear weapon as a way to create the advantageous kind of a threat against those parties who can be, involved in the crisis, on how they can deter the potential Western powers to be involved. Russian utilize the threat of nuclear weapons and escalation will be the way they can actually extend their, the fighting in the grounds, and how they can actually extend to the strategic messaging to others. And this is the kind of new way that nuclear weapon can be utilized, in which I think North Korea can really count on many space, because their developments of the nuclear weapons and missiles is the way to deter United States to militarily engage in the Korean Peninsula by looking at striking allies, Korea, Japan, and eventually the U.S. homeland. But now they are focusing more on the tactical side of the nuclear weapons, low yield, shorter range. And definitely that is to connect their conventional weapon capability into their escalation management, which means that the utilization of nuclear weapon is not the final kind of end means of what they are trying to deal with. It is the kind of simple escalation of how they can actually create the better kind of equation in relation with South Korea and the U.S. forces in Korea. So in that context, that the tension has been heightened, and then we have to deal with a new reality of how the extended deterrence nuclear domain can be applied to those areas. If it is not enough, or United States is not kind of try to adopt to those new reality, what the South Korea tried to say is that is not enough. We're going to have a new options, which involved our own nuclearization. And those kind of debates can emerge from the allies. I don't think that is a very productive kind of transaction that we have with Korea and Seoul and Tokyo in that context. So there should be need of more fine tunings of how the strategic relationship between the allies can deal with those kind of new situation arising in Korean Peninsula.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I think I'm going to take two questions. We'll take two questions bucket, and then we'll go back to online questions. You, sir, and then ma'am.
This question is for Ms. Kristen. I was wondering, can you briefly speculate on what's the adverse consequences facing Xi Jinping if he did not conclude reunification with Taiwan within his remaining term in office?
Okay, and let's have this this lady up here in the red coat. Just wait for the microphone, ma'am.
Thank you. Mine is very similar to yours. For Kristen, regarding the other factions within the CCP, the removal of Hu Jintao, so vulgar, it was vulgar. How is that influencing others who might possibly have a more peaceful approach to this?
Both questions, I think, are for Kristen.
Well, I always hope to avoid Taiwan in these discussions, but it always comes up. But these are great questions, and they really speak to sort of I would say the black box of Chinese leadership decision making. We've observed in the Xi Jinping era that his circle of advisors have gotten smaller and smaller, and so the people who have his ear are likely, just a small in number. And this, I think, does have consequences for the type of information he would get to make those decisions about, for example, whether to invade Taiwan, or conducting some of the coercive actions in that area. So it's hard to speculate on whether that means Xi Jinping is a weaker leader or a stronger leader, but I think it does speak to sort of, again, that he's probably not getting the breadth of information that that maybe Hu Jintao would have gotten, for example. We do know that one of the I guess cornerstone elements of his legacy that he said is reunification with Taiwan. That doesn't necessarily mean under armed reunification with Taiwan, but it does mean some kind of reunification. And I think there's an open debate about whether that means invading Taiwan and taking over the whole island, or whether there's something short of that, given the pretty disastrous consequences of a China-Taiwan U.S. conflict for China too, as well. So I think these are all open questions, and it's very difficult to predict. But I do think there's hope that I don't think conflict over Taiwan is inevitable, and I do think that maintaining the status quo as long as we can allows for some potential changes in Chinese domestic politics down the road, and that provides some hope. I don't know if you have another.
Yeah, certainly the question of Taiwan is always front and center in Washington. I mean, one of the things that I'd be interested, Kristen, your thoughts on this. I mean, I think one of the questions that's debated, or what are the lessons that China draws from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? You can sort of argue it both ways, but from my point of view, the experience of Russia in the invasion has to have driven home the risk to Beijing and to Xi Jinping of the use of force across the Taiwan Strait, right? Once you begin to exercise that option, you are unleashing all sorts of things that you can no longer control. And so I tend to believe that that is part of the message that has been received in Beijing. I continue to believe that deterrence can work. I think that this work that I talked about strengthening alliances and minilateralism and all that has an impact. I think some of what Japan is doing, I think when I sort of catalog the list of new variables that might serve to cause decision makers in China to think twice about the use of force, one of the things that would be near the top, I think, is the prospect of a Japan that has the ability to shoot back on its own at long range if US bases in Japan are struck. So I think Taiwan remains a very difficult situation and will for a long time. But I think deterrence is possible. And I think some of recent events may have sort of reinforced a sense of caution and realism about the implications of using force.
So I want to, we only have about 3 minutes left, and I do want to give the online questions another chance. I know in these hybrid events, sometimes the online questions gets pushed aside, but I want to give priority here as well. Joan, do we have another online question? Okay, if that's the case, then do we have any? I'll take one more question. The gentleman in the blue suit right there.
Thank you. My name is Avery Gonzalez, and I'm a fellow at the U.S. Space Force. I'm curious about if the recent events in space capability development have bled through the U.S. Japan alliance to increase cooperation, either militarily or scientifically. Dr. Jimbo, this question's partially to you because you had a slide that had a picture of satellites. But I'm curious to hear more about space cooperation. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. I think Chris knows much more about the details, but the space is one of the domains that United States and Japan has been working on as the core, cooperation, technological cooperation with together. And one of the things that we are going to obtain in the future is the space constellation system. It's collection of the satellites, which creates the more detail ISR capabilities from the space, the communication systems, which is a seamless. Latency is very limited, and that creates the better kind of the 5G environments that really operates not commercial, also on the security domains as well. So those creates the better platform for the U.S.-Japan seamless cooperation in the various domains. Chris, do you have any additional?
I just say very quickly, this is a new and rapidly growing area in the alliance context. There's always a fair amount of cooperation on space situational awareness, but there's also movement toward deeper cooperation than that. For example, hosted payload cooperation, right? Where Japanese satellites host a U.S. sensor, U.S. satellites host a Japanese sensor, in a way that really helps to strengthen space resilience and gives us more redundancy in the military space. So this is an area that's going to continue to grow rapidly.
Okay, I know there were more questions and I apologize. One of the hard things about being a moderator is saying no more questions. There's always going to be questions and I do apologize. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion. We will now break for lunch. We have 1 hour lunch. We'll have lunch put out on the tables there. Please feel free to grab lunch and enjoy discussion among friends here. And we will convene at 12:45. Thank you.